Okay, so our panel, this panel is on the cultures of area studies, and we have two speakers. We have Peter Zinoman, who's a professor of history at Berkeley, and we have Thongchai Winichakul, who is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Peter.
Okay, first let me just say thanks to Peng for putting this workshop or seminar together so quickly, and to Sarah Maxim for organizing it so efficiently. I also should apologize from at the outset here. I've been very under the weather this week, flat on my back actually with a bug, which has meant that I haven't quite finished my paper, so it's going to end a little bit abruptly, I fear. I also want to say something about some anxiety that I have regarding the audience for this piece. As you will see, what I'm basically talking about today is Anderson's association with a journal called Indonesia. And I think that many of the main constituencies for Anderson's work don't know anything about this journal or about Anderson's role in it. I think those who know Anderson primarily through Imagined Communities and the body of Imagined Communities related writing that he did afterwards are more or less innocent of this work. I think people who know Anderson as a theorist of globalism or of world literature tend not to have an idea about this part of his career. I think even those in Southeast Asian studies, like myself, who are not Indonesianists, those who study or those who know Anderson from his work on the other parts of the region that he specialized in, the Philippines and Thailand, I think this constituency is not always that familiar, or might not be that familiar with this. What I've come to discover is a very large and significant part of his career. On the other hand, there are also people who know a huge amount about this topic, and actually there's three of those people who are either here in the room now or out in the hall. Doug Cammon, Danilyn Rutherford, and Hank Mayer have all been involved in the journal. I have not, in one way or another, for quite a long time. So in figuring out how to pitch the talk, I sort of had to decide, should I pitch it to these three who know everything, or should I pitch it to everyone else who doesn't know anything? And so I've decided, obviously, to go with the latter. Please, the three of you, indulge me, or at least help me with Q&A when that comes around. It's perhaps not surprising that discussions of Ben Anderson's legacy in the wake of his death last December have tended to neglect his role as the founder and long-term editor of Indonesia, a biannual interdisciplinary academic journal based at Cornell, which celebrated its 50th birthday earlier this year, or late last year, in fact. Anderson's commanding role at the helm of Indonesia for nearly 5 decades goes unmentioned in his two big American obituaries, published in the New York Times and in the LA Times. Nor is it mentioned in lengthy appreciations printed in the New Republic, the Bangkok Post, the Jakarta Post, or the Calcutta Telegraph. Indeed, outside of several Facebook postings, the only reference I could find to this aspect of Anderson's career in the wave of eulogies and testimonials that recently appeared was a single unexplained reference tucked into an obituary penned by Anthony Reid in the London Guardian. Reid is the only guy who actually mentions it. One obvious reason for this neglect is that the massive size and wide-ranging scope of Anderson's work and legacy has left well-meaning eulogists with little choice but to selectively highlight some aspects of Anderson's career while leaving others by the wayside. So far, priority has been given, understandably, I believe, to the body of research that he carried out, the trove of writing that he published, the collection of translations that he completed, the cohort of graduate students that he trained, the political advocacy that he engaged in, as well as his work as an energetic institution builder of Cornell's famous Modern Indonesia Project and Southeast Asia program. However, a case can be made, I think, that Anderson's journal is as significant a part of his legacy as these more widely touted elements of his life's work. How would one make such a case? Well, on the one hand, I think that the journal must be seen as one of the most powerful engines for the growth of Indonesian studies globally in the post-World War II era. For no less than 50 years between 1966 and 2016, it's really an astonishing duration for a non-state supported institution of this nature, Indonesia has provided a unique platform for the presentation of extremely high-quality research, writing, and thinking about the country. Based on my own very crude back-of-the-envelope calculations, it has published in its pages roughly 600 research articles, 200 book reviews, 25 multi-book review essays, more or less 100 translations of original literary and historical documents, and 50 detailed obituaries of both scholars of the country and important Indonesian historical figures. If you wanted to break all this material down by discipline, it's about 40% of this material is sort of crudely be categorized as history, and 40% history, literature, politics, and anthropology each garner about 20% each, roughly. Moreover, a glance through the back matter of back issues of the journal indicate that Indonesia has always featured a large amount of work, a disproportionate amount of work, I would argue, by graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and assistant professors. Indeed, during the early years of the journal, many of the issues are only list work by junior scholars, either at a pre-dissertation or very recently post-dissertation stage. These are the kind of folks who are often struggling to land jobs and earn tenure in a tough academic environment. Hence, the journal has done more than make this enormous body of scholarly work on Indonesia broadly available for research and teaching in the classroom, but it has also helped to secure, I would argue, the long-term professional viability of the long-term community of Indonesianists. Without this journal as an outlet for the work of neophyte scholars, up-and-coming scholars, one wonders whether the Euro-American Academy, or I guess the Academy including in places like Australia, would be peppered with so many talented Indonesianists who have long-term positions, job security, and the ability to sort of carry on the tradition, training graduate students themselves. Moreover, the very unusual ethos of the journal has nurtured, I believe, several extremely positive or virtuous qualities within the field of Indonesian studies. In a short essay about the journal published on its 25th anniversary, Anderson described this ethos as a, quote, half-breed spirit. And according to him, this half-breed spirit represented a fusion of the intellectual personality of, on the one hand, the Cold War era British journal, the China Quarterly, and on the other, the Old Dutch colonial scholarly journal known as De Jawa. From the China Quarterly, according to Anderson, Indonesia borrowed a preoccupation with current politics and policies, theoretical debates on the nature of Indonesian history and society, and efforts to understand military and civilian leadership groups as they change over time. The fact that Indonesia was founded in the immediate wake of the 1965 coup and Anderson's work on the Cornell White Paper, as discussed by Doug Kamen, and at a moment when the U.S. escalation in Vietnam was reaching sort of its first major climax, with ground troops first introduced into Vietnam in the summer of '65, and then sort of massively accelerating towards the end of that year. These events clearly linked the journal from its inception to various urgent political imperatives of that era. And I think those imperatives, even though that era evolved, time flows, time evolves, those concerns are less pressing, they retain a kind of centrality at the core of the journal's heart. From Djawa, this colonial amateur scholarly journal that was based in the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia borrows three different impulses, according to Anderson. One was what he calls a feeling of love and a sense of connection for its object of study, something that he claims you don't find in your run-of-the-mill political science journals. A second was an omnivorous curiosity about all things Indonesian that Anderson saw as characteristic of the intellectual labor of amateur Dutch scholar officials during the late colonial era. And finally, Indonesia borrowed from Djawa a passion for empirical detail connected to these two previous impulses. In the loving style of Djawa, he wrote in this piece, quote, Indonesia has continued to publish articles much longer than those usually tolerated by disciplinary journals. The assumption continues to be that readers who know and love their Indonesia will not be bored or made restless by Indonesian detail. I love that formulation. And if you read back issues of the journal, what's really one of the really most striking things about it is, you know, almost every issue you find articles 50, 60, 70 pages long, densely footnoted in multiple languages, and very little effort to sort of dumb things down for a kind of outsider or to frame arguments for kind of a generalist audience who might not know the background or might not be up on the latest scholarship. There's a kind of, I never submitted a piece to the journal, and there may be people here who have, but I doubt that editors ever wrote back a note saying, you know, add more theoretical context at the beginning, or give us, what about a comparison with South Korea? That's the kind of response that, you know, disciplinary journals will frequently give you. It's usually the first thing. Work on your framing to speak to a larger audience. I don't think the editors of Indonesia ever gave that kind of advice to the authors. At least it doesn't appear from the pieces that appear in the pages. And I don't want to overstate it, of course. The journal is not totally atheoretical, but what's really striking is the kind of denseness of Indonesian empirical data that's presented and a kind of confidence that an audience exists, or that an audience that might not quite, maybe it doesn't quite exist, but it could rise to the challenge of sort of figuring things out enough to make sense of work of this level of intensity. This half-breed style of Indonesia has helped to nurture, in my outside opinion, a kind of academic culture within Indonesian studies that, from the perspective of Vietnamese studies, which is where I come from, looks a lot richer, more sophisticated, frankly better as a form of area studies than in our field, and then I think in most other country fields. I'd be interested in our colleagues in the Philippine studies, for example, which is maybe the closest, I think, in terms of having this kind of level of empirical rigor and intensity. But I think, you know, it's pretty widely believed that Indonesian studies within Southeast Asian studies is the sort of jewel in the crown, and I think that's reflected very, very clearly in this kind of odd quality that the journal has. On balance, I would say that this academic culture of Indonesian studies, it can be marked by the fact that it's simultaneously rigorous intellectually, literate culturally, and engaged politically. And you find those as sort of three core elements of Indonesian studies as practiced by that journal. I want to turn now and talk more specifically about Anderson's own contribution to both the launch of the journal and to its sustenance over the years. In a short piece published in 1990, Anderson wrote that the idea for the journal was the collective brainchild of a group of young scholars associated with the Cornell Indonesia Project in the mid-1960s, the political scientists Ruth McVeigh and Fred Bunnell, and the anthropologist Jim Siegel. Quite soon, Anderson continued, this circle of discussion widened to comrades at Yale and Berkeley in Holland, Australia, and Indonesia, unquote. There is no doubt that many people were involved in these early conversations, as Anderson modestly points out. But other accounts of the journal's birth identify Anderson himself as something of a singular driving force. According to the political scientist George Cahan, who was both the founder of Cornell's Modern Indonesia Project and Anderson's thesis supervisor, quote, one of the outstanding achievements of Cornell's Modern Indonesia Project during this period was the launching of the project's interdisciplinary journal, Indonesia. The idea for this was Ben Anderson's, and for him it was a formidable labor of love, many hours being devoted to its nourishment and steady growth. Cahan's recollection is confirmed by a brief memoir published last October by his widow, Audrey Cahan, who worked as the journal's managing editor between 1978 and 1995. Quote, Ben Anderson, still at the time a graduate student in Cornell's government department, was largely responsible for launching the journal, assisted mostly by his fellow graduate students in the Southeast Asia program. Perhaps more remarkable than the fact that Anderson founded Indonesia while still a graduate student with an unfinished dissertation was his enduring commitment to it over the years. For the 8 issues put out during the first 4 years of its existence, the journal was produced, as Cahan suggests, by a kind of ad hoc editorial board made up of young scholars whose 4 to 6 members changed from issue to issue. Ruth McVeigh appears on 6 of these boards, Jim Siegel and Elizabeth Graves 3 apiece. Only Anderson served on all 8. During 1970 and 1971, Anderson co-edited the journal together with Elizabeth Graves. Between 1972 and 1976, he co-edited it with Susan Hatch, and between 1976 and 1978, he's listed as the co-editor with the anthropologist Judith Eklund. In 1979, Audrey Cahan came aboard for the next 11 years, and during this period, she co-edited the journal together with Anderson, who was sometimes listed as her co-editor and sometimes listed as the sole contributing editor. Between 1991 and 1995, a new editorial structure emerged, with Audrey Cahan being listed as the sole editor and Anderson and historian Takashi Shiraishi serving as contributing editors. The retirement of Audrey Cahan in 1995 triggered another structural overhaul. For the decade between 1996 and 2006, editorial leadership over the journal moved into the hands of 3 contributing editors, Anderson, Shiraishi, and Siegel, with managing editing duties assumed by Deborah Hampshire. In 2007, Josh Barker replaced Siegel, joining Anderson and Shiraishi as one of the 3 contributing editors. It was only in October 2008, 42 years after he appeared atop the very first masthead of the journal, that Anderson retreated to the newly formed editorial advisory board, a position that he maintained until his death. 42 years. Taking into consideration a couple of special issues put out by guest editors, Anderson served in a core editorial capacity for Indonesia for an astonishing 83 issues during the 4 decades between 1966 and 2008. In addition to his long-term editorial leadership, Anderson supported Indonesia by publishing a wide variety of his own writing in it. Indeed, the 35 pieces that he authored or co-authored in the journal represent more submissions than any other scholar, with Jim Siegel as a close second, having published 32 pieces in the journal. These include field notes, obituaries of important scholars in the field, and short pieces, some of an almost experimental nature. They also include the important, lengthy research articles, The Languages of Indonesian Politics, published in the first issue of the journal in 1966, and a piece that comes to be known as Cartoons and Monuments, The Evolution of Political Communication Under the New Order, which came out under a slightly different title in 1973. Both of those pieces were republished in his collection Language and Power. In addition, Anderson published in Indonesia close to 20 translations into English from Indonesian or Javanese of a wide variety of texts of different genres and styles: pre-modern poetry, modern short stories, political memoirs, interviews with notable persons, and in one really fascinating case, the forensic autopsies of the 7 Indonesian military officers killed at the outset of the infamous coup of October 1965. Many of these translations come adorned with short introductions or efficient contextual essays. After Anderson was able to return to Indonesia in 1999, is that true? After he was able to return to Indonesia, he began writing pieces in Indonesian that targeted an Indonesian audience exclusively. He translated several such pieces back into English for publication in the journal. These include Anderson's keynote address delivered at the Hotel Borobudur in 1999, entitled Indonesian Nationalism Today and in the Future, and the widely disseminated mini pamphlet Bung Karno and the Fossilization of Sukarno's Thought, which came out in 2001. In addition to these 35-odd pieces, close to one per year, Anderson also authored many installments of a remarkable long-running 29-installment-long series that appeared in Indonesia entitled Current Data on the Indonesian Military Elite. The first installment appeared in the 3rd issue of the journal in April of 1967 and opened with the following brief note. Since the coup of October 1st, the Indonesian army has assumed an increasingly prominent role in Indonesian politics, particularly after the March 11th, 1966 effective transfer of power from President Sukarno to General Suharto. The army has assumed the dominant position in the government, although still relying on a number of civilian ministers and advisors. Simultaneous with the shifting of power within the government elite, the army itself has undergone a major reshuffling of its general-grade officers. In an effort to facilitate understanding of the magnitude and character of these post-coup intra-army shifts, the editors of Indonesia have assembled a listing of the recent occupants of the major central and regional army positions. In the case of each position, as the sample below illustrates, the names of the officers holding the position between October 1st, 1965 and January 1st, 1967 are indicated. Wherever possible, the date of installation of the office holder of October 1st, 1965 is given together with the name of his predecessor. Notation of the divisional and ethnic background of office holders is also provided. Finally, ever conscious of their own limited knowledge and resources, the editors invite corrections and additions from the reader with the view to subsequent publication of a more complete and accurate compilation of data on the most prominent group in Indonesia's contemporary political elite, unquote. This short preface was followed by an 11-page chart, which essentially represented a form of Kremlinology, an effort to organize limited data about the Indonesian officer corps so as to draw some crude conclusions about continuity and change over time within this opaque and poorly understood new political elite. In subsequent installments, these conclusions focused on levels of centralization and Javanization within the officer corps, on various regional, ethnic, generation, and educational dynamics, and on the relative power of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and police, among many other matters. According to Doug Kamen, who graciously has told me a lot about what he knows about this series in a recent email, and who worked on the series starting in the late 1990s, much of the data from the series was culled from Indonesia's main military paper, the Armed Forces Daily, along with snippets of information drawn from the civilian press and various other sources. While later installments followed the basic pattern established in the inaugural issue, i.e. some brief analytical comments followed by the presentation of raw data, the preliminary analytical section grew in length and complexity as the series evolved over time. By the 9th installment in 1983, the introduction ran 6 pages. By the 11th installment, it ran 9 pages. By the 13th installment, it was up to 15 pages. And the most recent installments in 2003, 2005, 2008, 2013, the analytical sections run well over 20 pages. And I would say since roughly the 8th installment in 1980, the analytical introduction to the data reads like a brief, sort of data-rich analytical article. It's not simply an introduction. It's more qualitative and quantitative analysis, and it looks like it takes quite a bit of work to put it together. What was Anderson's role in? What was Anderson's precise role in putting together this series? Well, as far as I can reconstruct, again with the help of Doug and also looking at an old CV of Anderson that's available online, he was largely responsible for writing more or less by himself, got it, the first 14 installments that came out during the 22 years between 1967 and 1989. Thereafter, he collaborated with various colleagues on about half a dozen installments before ceding responsibility for the series to others, including Doug Kamen, Shira Ishii, and eventually Jun Hona. The dry Kremlinological style of the series offers a stunning contrast to the elegant literary translations and intricate essays on cultural politics that he was writing at the same time, and stand as a testament to his extraordinary range as a scholar. Opinion is mixed regarding how widely read this frankly dry and quite technical series has been, but George Kane once remarked that Indonesian military attachés scattered around the world especially seem to value Ben Anderson's periodic analyses of changes and appointments to senior military positions found in current data on the Indonesian military elite. Okay, I'm almost finished, Peng. The durability of Anderson's devotion to a journal narrowly focused on Indonesia is even more striking, I think, given the twisty trajectory of his career. As is well known, after being banned from Indonesia in 1972, Anderson turned his attention to Thailand and spent much of the latter part of that decade deeply immersed in the study of Thai language, history, culture, and politics. In 1983, he took his famous global turn with the publication of Imagined Communities. When I started at Cornell in the late 1980s, Anderson had already started conducting serious work on the Philippines, which involved studying both Spanish and Tagalog and immersing himself in the writings of Jose Rizal and many others. And yet, even as he intensely pursued these new research interests, Anderson continued to sit atop the editorial hierarchy of Indonesia and to contribute all manner of interesting pieces to it. For example, during the same year, 1978, that he publishes Studies of the State of Thai Studies, a seminal essay that, in the words of Tamara Luce, revealed that Ben had recently read all of the scholarship available, including unpublished dissertations on that country's history, politics, and culture. He also publishes in Indonesia a wonderful translation of Prajona's MMM and Pramudia's famous story, Revenge. Similarly, while Anderson's most well-known works from the first half of the 1980s are Imagined Communities and his book-length study of Thai fiction in the Mirror, which comes out in 1985, this 6-year period, 1980 to 85, also witnesses the publication in Indonesia of his translation of the 30-page-long PKI memoir on Muso's return, his heavily annotated translation of the 100-page-long 19th century Javanese poem, The Suluk Gato Loco, translations of 3 more Pramudia short stories, as well as the fascinating memoir by the Berlin-based Indonesian exile Pipit Rochajat, Am I PKI or Not PKI, which, like In the Mirror, a book of translations, also comes out in 1985. Anderson also put out by himself 5 installments of current data on the Indonesian military elite during the same 6-year period between 1980 and 1985. Did he ever sleep? Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker for this session before lunch is Thongchai Winichakul.
Thank you for putting this event together. when Ben passed away, I didn't think about writing anything. A few people asked. I have to admit that I didn't think about writing because I don't know what to write, but I read almost everything that people wrote about him. Let me start with a simple anecdote. How well do I know Ben? In fact, not close, as some people may think. Some people even thought that I'm from Cornell. No, I've never been to Cornell until 1990s. Actually, I applied to Cornell, but was rejected because my TOEFL was too low. True. Cornell, Berkeley usually rejected me because my TOEFL. Unlike many other people here who once were his students, the most I could claim is that I was a long-distance student who took no course and only few private conversations, mostly brief and not on serious issues. The longest one-on-one conversation with him was only once. Once, yep. When I sought his advice whether I should come to the US, to Wisconsin. And the longest time I ever spent with him was a trip with Chandrika Sesiri, Ben and me, to Wat Phu in southern Laos. You can imagine traveling with a giant in the field and my teacher, both of whom are close friends, how I behaved during the trip, listening to their conversations quietly most of the time. But I have been influenced by his work since the state of Thai studies, and especially by emerging communities, which I will identify from now on just as IC, as Ben himself identified or call it in the latest chapter added to the latest edition in 2006. So I was influenced by IC after it was first published in 1983. And his support of me in many ways, in so many ways, was enormously helpful to me in thinking intellectually and to my career too. The not close but not too distant relationship allows me to observe the Ben phenomenon among the circle of his Thai students over the years. I have to say that they invited me to join that circle in early 1990s. For some reason, I'm not going to elaborate. That's the only time I went and I told myself, I'm not going to go again. Especially how IC has been received in Thailand. You may say that I have some critical observations, yes. From the other side of his added chapter to the final edition of the IC, the added chapter titled Travel and Traffic on the Geobiography of Emerging Communities. You may think of a different title of that chapter of his as IC in translation. I assume that many of you have read that. That chapter could be talk about translation to many languages, when and how, who was the publisher, and some background of the publishers. Then my observation today would be about the other side of the traffic, or you may call, if the chapter called IC in translation, my talk is IC translated. But reading about IC, especially after his passing, in relation to how it is translated, leads me beyond the IC translated to two other related issues. What nation did Ben imagine? What is the value of IC to the world of knowledge? And in what way it is particularly meaningful to me, to us, to us who do Asian studies. In other words, these are the four parts I'm going to talk about. The first is speculation. The second is observation. The third is about style of thinking. The fourth is my wishful thinking. When I submit the abstract for this talk, I had not seen the extract from his autobiography in the LRB. So since I read it from the LRB London Review of Books, I thought, uh-oh, Ben answered some of my questions already. Yet, I think some part of the puzzle remains, regardless of what Ben himself might have said. I.C. argues that nationhood is a community of horizontal relations among people who share a sense of belonging to the same imagined entity. It is effective and effective, powerful to make things happen, even to die for it. Apart from writing I.C. as a polemic in the context of debate between Tom Nairn and Eric Hobsbawm, what else contributes to Ben's view of the imagined nationhood or such a horizontal national belonging? Ben's background hardly have any true root in any nation, but staying in a country as an alien of one sort or another. That seems to be his biography. Having no true root in any nation, but staying in a country as an alien of one sort or another, make me wonder if he can have a nation to belong to. He told us he took the side of the Indian students in their contention with the UK authorities when he was studying in UK, in Cambridge. Thanks partly to his Irish anathema to England. He stays for the most part of his life in the US, yet he holds on to his Irish passport. His study of nationalism has nothing to do with a sense of belonging to any nation. Indeed, I wonder if he has a sense of belonging to a nation. He probably cannot. This is why the part I call it's my speculation. I don't know, and I can't ask him anymore. I.C. was probably the result of the lack of empathy or animosity to a nation, of absence of belonging or hatred to a nation. It is like a secular atheist scholar studies comparative religion. If he cannot and does not belong to any nation, what inspired him to write about a powerful and positive nationhood? He mentioned his feeling like cheering the anti-American phrase, "to hell with your aid," as if he were, quote, becoming a kind of Indonesian nationalist. That is his quote from the chapter, Travel and Traffic. There were many kinds of Indonesian nationalists. Which kind he almost became? Sukarno? My speculation is Sultan Syahrir, a socialist intellectual thinker, idealist nationalist leader, a tragic figure of Indonesian anti-colonial nationalism who was jailed after independence that he fought for, and who went to exile in Zurich until the end of his life. Ben's imagination about powerful camaraderie nationhood probably associates with the leftist, idealistic, anti-colonial nationalism. Creole nationalists were the instigator of his story. They were the agency of his history because that's the anti-colonial nationalist he imagined. Unfortunately, the kind of Indonesian nationalist by which I guess he was inspired was betrayed and was never realized. His model of imagined community is perhaps forever imagined. But the forever imagined community is good enough for him to contemplate on how it originated and spread. Ireland and Indonesia notwithstanding, an imagined nationhood is the effect of the mediation of language in different modes: print capitalism, vernacular, translation, so on and so forth. Ben imagined communities. When I talk IC, I mean the book. When I mention imagined communities, I mean the word. as it is. Ben's imagined community perhaps exists only in his meditation on language and on how it mediates ideas and idealism across different linguistic landscapes. I believe scholars in Thailand who read IC do not know that it is a polemic in relation to Nine Hobsbawm debate. I didn't know either when I was influenced by it, but it didn't matter. We take it as we can take it. I think Thailand doesn't know Sharia either. There was no anti-colonial movement in Thailand, let alone a left-leaning one, unless you count the Communist Party. There is no idealistic, tragic anti-colonial thinker in Thailand. The imagined Thai nationhood so far has not been a fertile ground for cultivating Ben's ideal imagined community. The dominant royal nationalism is inherently hierarchical. The community is imagined was an organic society of people subservient to the establishment for the sake of societal harmony. This is the ideological and linguistic environment for the Thai translation of IC by, in Ben's words, quote, a team of progressive critical professors. Hence, as Ben remarked, I let you read it. I was very surprised by one thing: the order of Thai monarchy is such that I expect the translator to use a special field of vocabulary required when describing any activity by Thai kings past and present. What I didn't expect is that the same special vocabulary was applied to all foreign monarchs as well, including such unlovely figures such as London, William the Conqueror, Paris, François I, Vienna, France II, Berlin, William II, and so on. When the object to the entire spirit of IC, that the entire spirit of IC is republican, small r, and almost all monarchs are handled with iron and hostility, the objection was quickly brushed aside. Quote, you don't understand our tradition and our situation. With a mixture of laughter and apprehension, I look forward to what may be taken as IC's first royalist translation. In other words, royal nationalism in Thailand is a mother tongue language, of which the translation made it into. As Ben always warned us, we learn other foreign language through our mother tongues. That's from Marx. This is how IC translates into Thai, into its own mother tongue language. I use the word language here not as language as such, but it is a language. The existing linguistic precondition makes the translator assumes that the tradition and situation is beyond their ability to impede without losing the communicability. In fact, in my opinion, this assumption is not true. They can impede, although it requires a willingness, and in this case, strong political willingness to take some risk. I mean, not to use. There are people who not using royal vocabulary to many kings, including to the Thai kings, and escape the authority attention. There are, if they want to. In this case, it looked like the translator did not even think about it. The Thai IC, the book and its substance, is also translated into local conditions, that is, localized into local conditions in some other ways too. Here are some observations which need to be thought over more carefully, particularly the third one. I'm going to mention in passing. I don't have time to read in full. I prefer to focus more on part 3 and part 4. 1. The discourse on IC in Thailand is hardly about the role of language in creating nationhood, the importance of Creole nationalism, and so on. Instead, the attention of most of the time to the chapter on official nationalism. Even print capitalism is not discussed much in the Thai context, among the Thai academics. Perhaps for a number of reasons, because that chapter used Syme as one of the most important cases in discussing that chapter. Or maybe other reasons, I'm not sure. Second, in the landscape of various ideologies in Thailand, the prevalent and official nationalism is militaristic and royalist one. Yet, most people, including those critics of it, this is my view, including those critics of it, commonly nationalism naturally good. It would turn bad only when it is extreme. So why Ben's positive approach to nationalism is a response to generally negative view towards nationalism in the West, where not many people and no political party claim to be nationalistic except the right wing. Ben's and IC have been authoritative voice in support of the advocacy for good nationalism in Thailand. After Ben's passing last month, less than a month ago, there was a meeting, a conference. The title is exactly, and the abstract, the main message of the conference is exactly on that. It's about good nationalism. The abstract tells us support Ben or cheer up Ben because it says nationalism is good. Number 3, Kru Ben. Ben Anderson, known among the academic community in Thailand as Kru Ben, Guru Ben. Thanks to the circle of his students, many of whom become prominent scholars and well-known public intellectuals in the country. They tell the public about Kru Ben long before and much more than IC. I'm not sure if people enjoy reading IC translation, which in my personal opinion is even harder to understand than in English. But I am not surprised if people love to possess IC in translation, because, you know, as Southeast Asianists, it represents Kru Ben, which is probably is higher value than IC. IC was translated in many notions of the term translations. IC itself is an exchange commodity, and the idea and the exchange commodities like a language that can create effects as it spreads from its origin. Between the lines of the geobiography chapter is a yet to be written account of how the flow of IC has mediated various effects across different intellectual landscapes. The chapter should have been read, or still should be read as Travel and Traffic, the origin and spread of IC, the book. You know, the origin and spread of is from the subtitle of the book. It is now well known that Ben is polyglot. But beyond admiration and fascination with his amazing ability with languages, what else should we learn from him and about the significance of such ability? This is addressed to your question. The attention should be on how the command of language can produce a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be compared with, let alone replaced by, the scientific approach to human and the world. Learning different languages opens the door to different worlds, cultures, human society, and histories to our thinking. In other words, open the door to many linguistic worlds, to many language worlds. Learning a foreign language unavoidably entails, I would say, automatically, consciously or not, comparison. As Ben testified on several occasions about importance of comparison, and he testified even in his talk about the making of IC, he always tells us about how the idea originally started from some kind of comparison between different worlds. IC and Ben's later book, Spectre of Comparison and Under Three Flags, are best evidence of these human capacities. Indeed, knowing different languages is comparativism in practice. And comparing different languages and societies is to learn different languages too. Think about, I use the word language here in a broad sense of the term, as this twin process, knowing different languages and comparing different cultures. As these twin learnings combine and become an enterprise, it produces a particular kind of knowledge whose value lies in the distinctiveness from the scientific one and other kinds of knowledge. And the value doesn't lie in how much monetary effect it can generate. We have known this particular kind of knowledge as area studies. Generally speaking, area studies knowledge rests on two twin elements. The command of different languages, at least one other than our own native one. And two, comparison. Whether or not consciously, upon which a formulation of knowledge is founded. The comparison that comes with learning of a foreign or different languages and culture is, we may say, a form of translation. Right? Think about it. Keep in mind that translation form a significant corpus of Ben Anderson's works too. I think something in connection, translation, comparisons, and the way or the style of his thinking. This is the essence of this section, style of thinking. Translation, according to Lydia Liu, is a symbolic and material exchange among peoples and civilizations and not purely linguistic or literary matter. The production and circulation of meaning as value take place in many areas, including history, religion, blah, 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 and so on, at those moments in which meaning, value exchange from one language to another. Comparison is also a transaction or an exchange of intellectual value. Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta were among the arch translators of Asian studies. Don't you think so? So were Buddhist pilgrims since over 2,000 years ago, who crisscrossed over the land and maritime Silk Roads. Even colonization, even colonizers involved in the production of knowledge by translation in action. We are all travelers, intellectually and physically. We are all interpreters who do translation in action. We are all. Who move across comparing different languages, different language worlds, and create knowledge based on comparison and translation, whether or not we're conscious about that, we are doing that. Whether or not we do what quality, we are doing that. People who do area study, who do Asian studies. I recently have read about Prasenjit Dura and have talked about him several times. I give this example instead of Ben because you know Ben already. Prasenjit Dura is from Assam, a periphery of India, to study at Harvard, one of the educational holy land, studying rural China with influences from Japanese sinology. As Prasenjit put it, he has crossed so many borders, geographical and cultural, between old and new nations, between urban and rural, between, I would say, different ecologies of academia, in Ben's word. Then, at every crossing arises specter of comparison. They compare first and foremost because they try to translate it into their own language, into their own understanding. There are, even those scholars who understand another language in its own term, transaction of languages hardly stops. Then you can put Ben's biography here. How many borders he crisscrossed, how many times, how many places he has to translate in the broad sense of the word. Ben was epitome of the producer of knowledge via translation. Or I may call it epitome of area studies knowledge, which ultimately is the knowledge produced by translation in practice. IC itself is an epitome of the knowledge produced by comparison, thus by translation. Needless to say, talking about translation, I have one huge section I'm going to cut here. Simply put, the cliche of loss in translation is not actually true. Area studies and Ben's work is a testimony, is an evidence that we have added a lot in translation, in practicing translation by area studies. Needless to say, Ben's style of thinking in comparison, in terms of comparativism and translation, is several notches further from the usual style of comparison. Let's say, talk about myself. My sense of comparison in doing area studies is that it's usually logical, very logical comparison. Ben's comparison is usually ironic, disjunctive, disruptive, absurd, surprising. I may say Ben's comparison is usually illogical to me. I'm going to leave this for Vince's talk this afternoon. But we all do comparison in translation. Last section. Sorry, take it too long. Ariel Hurianto. Sorry. Give me a few more minutes. Ariel Hurianto writes in his tribute to Ben, titled The One and Only, that Ben was a proof of the value of language learning. I let you read a few, less than a minute, and I'll go on. I love Hurianto's piece very much, except the title, The One and Only. Is Ben Anderson the one and only? Would Ben like to be one and only? The question is not about the past and the present. It is not to question, let alone a needless debate on who else is comparable to Ben. I'm not interested in that kind of issue. The question is for the future. Do we want him and a few others like him to remain extraordinary ones and to remain the extraordinary one and only into the future? Should he be the one and only? Should we ask him, should we take him as an archetype of ordinary scholars in the future? Can we make his archetype an ordinary phenomenon in the future? Could we? Should we? Aim high to take him as a model for future citizens who not only are multilingual, but also equipped with the ability to intellectually move across various language roles by comparison and by translation competency. This is a question for area studies. This is a question for Asian studies. Our usual justification for value of area studies, our defense against a cut in language learning, usually involve the proof of market worth and its economic value. I think its real value is in that it produces totally different kinds of knowledge, irrepressible and incompatible with the scientific method. It's a different kinds of knowledge. I think the world is moving towards multilingual one, both at the societal and individual level. One paradoxical effect of globalization is that the prevalence of English in the global scale on the one hand, but on the other, the increasing number of bilingual and multilingual citizens across the globe become common. The fate of people with limited linguistic ability like me could be soon like a dinosaur. Is multilingual ordinary citizen an unrealistic dream? I believe it's not. If it is not, is translation competency the ability we would like to see common among global citizens in the future? If yes, if it is not unrealistic to aim for ordinary citizen who is equipped with ability to move across different language, like most area specialists like us today. If it's not unrealistic, we should aim high. Perhaps it's too high to dream of a polyglot scholar like Ben to be common among citizens, but let that the capacity of the scholars in the future. Is it legitimate to aim high and work towards such a goal? Can Asian study play an important role in the making of multilingual citizens with translation competency? Can Asian study, should Asian study aim high to make Ben not the one and the only?
Thank you for such a rousing talk. So we'll have 15 minutes for questions, and it will eat into our lunchtime for about 10 minutes or so, but that will be fine. Can I have takers for questions? Show of hands about people who have questions. Like an auction house. Vince, please.
Thanks for the presentation. It's very, very interesting. One of the things that comes out both in your presentations and the earlier ones was the fact that so much of Ben was about, on the one hand, he was this sort of dynamo who did all this labor, a lot of it unacknowledged, invisible, and yet producing all these incredible effects, such as in the journal Indonesia, right? The other aspect of Ben that came out in Thongchai's account was Ben as an icon, as almost a fetish, a cipher, around which people galvanized and read all kinds of things into, right? And I'm just wondering that, so my first question is, how do you reconcile these two? And this is perhaps not unusual. This is perhaps something that happens with everybody, right? On the one hand, there's somebody who's very much concerned with the sort of the material processes and effects, and politics, as Doug's paper very clearly illuminated, the politics of work, of labor, academic labor. And on the other hand, this person who sort of steps into this world where he is seen as a star, a celebrity, a fetish. So that's one question. The second question, and this has to do with the whole question of translation, I completely agree with Thongchai about how so much of Ben's work is about translation. What I would disagree with, what I would add rather, and I think the Lydia Liu sort of quotation is in some ways sort of deceptive. But what I would add is that I think he was also very conscious of the fact that translation was a political act, that there are limits to the sort of translative capacities of people because of the particular kind of historical and social and economic conditions they live in, right? And in the case of Ben, he wasn't a polyglot by accident. He was a polyglot because he went to Cambridge, he was a classicist, he imbued the sort of multilingual, I mean, he spent his summers in France, he traveled through Germany, and on and on and on and on. So that's one thing, that translation is political, it's connected to modalities of power. The second thing is that translation is also an ethic. That for Ben, it grows out of a relationship of love, and this is where the whole imagined community comes from. Every single Southeast Asian language Ben learned plunged him, if he wasn't already plunged, into a community of sentiment, right? Students, lovers, family, that he went to regularly, right? Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. We all know that, and this is a very common thing. You can't really learn a language unless you fall in love, not just with the language, but with speakers of that language. Preferably someone very intimate, right? You develop this intimacy with language. So you're actually forced to speak it, not just on a sort of, a theoretical level, but on the most idiomatic level. So that's what I would want to emphasize, is that if you're going to talk about translation, you always have to emphasize these two, the ethic and the politics of translation. And this means that the dream of translation that you were talking about, right, that this dream will also plunge us into a war, conflict, insurgencies of all sorts. So, thanks.
So, would you, either of you, as I guess especially Thongchai, would you like to respond to this comment?
My response to the first question, how I reconcile, I don't know, but I'm not surprised because I think, don't you think paradox is normal? Yeah. I mean, no need to reconcile. No, not for all of us. Not for all of us, not for all phenomenon, not for all phenomena, but let's say paradox of this kind is not uncommon. It's not uncommon, they coexist. I think partly because with whatever Ben want or would like it to be, he is a social being. He's part of many others. In the sense he's part of larger interrelation with other people. So then I'm not saying that he himself is paradox in the sense that he wants to be something, but he is actually another thing. No, he's as in terms of social meaning, the paradox exists. Number two, translation, the political and ethical. It could lead to the kind of conflict. Everything, another paradox is possible, but I still think in terms of, let's talk about, if he say nationalism is positive, many other examples we can say nationalism is negative. I wouldn't argue that which one is correct. No, because it's both. In this case, that's why I mentioned that the dream or the aim for the ability to be multilingual and translation on comparative competency is for the future. Meaning, yes, there is a risk. But I think, of course, I don't think about polyglot like Ben. Put this way, I like sport. I often put comparison to sport. Not so long ago, it's hard to imagine human can run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. How come? We can't imagine that human has ability to learn multi-language more and more, because it's hard for us to think, because we live in a time that is unthinkable. Is it possible for people to learn about comparison and translation competency carefully, responsibly, politically, and ethically too? I leave that rather than question.
So Peter would like to respond.
I'll just respond to your first question about the possible paradox or the relationship between Glenn as a worker bee and Glenn as a celebrity academic. I think in terms of the journal, the two things really worked hand in hand. In other words, his celebrity really facilitated, to a large extent, the success of the journal, especially during its later phases. And I came to understand this through, I'll give a little bit of background of why I decided to write this work on this topic. So inspired by Indonesia in the journal in the mid-2000s, I decided, well, Vietnam Studies doesn't have a journal. I've always admired Indonesia. Maybe I'll try to start a journal along the lines of Indonesia, I innocently, naively thought. And so raised some money in 2005 and founded a journal called Journal of Vietnamese Studies at Berkeley. And what I quickly came to realize is that you can, raise money and gather, staff to put this kind of thing together, but that to really found and run a journal, it takes this incredible diversity of skills, this very broad skill set, including linguistic skills and editing and how to fix arguments and how to just there's many how to work with people, things that academics not normally are that good at, but also you need to, because it's very much a collective endeavor, you need to draw people to you. You need to be able to get people to work for free, to review articles at the last second, to submit things that they might not feel comfortable with. You have to inspire them. And I learned that there's no way that my journal could be even a tenth as interesting as Ben's journal, because I just didn't have that same level of, that same skill set. And I really think that his charisma, which we haven't really talked about, is clearly a key part of the magnetism of the journal. I mean, I can only imagine what it must have been like to get his comments on your article or to be asked to review something, or, right, there's a kind of productivity and energy and synchronicity that can come out of him at being at the center of this enterprise that I think wouldn't work really with anyone else in the field. So in this case, I think the labor of the journal and his celebrity, both outside of the field but also within the field, which emerges earlier, they work together.
Except I would emphasize, especially in the early part, the collaborative aspect of it. Because you had Ben, you had Jim, you had Oliver Walters, even Stan O'Connor. You had this whole collection of incredible sort of figures in music studies that were very much involved. I couldn't imagine Indonesia and Educayans, I couldn't imagine it taking off without that. There may be, retrospectively, it looks like Ben was the star in the center. But actually, from the detailed description you gave, it's apparent that Ben flourished because he made everyone else flourish and everyone else made him flourish.
Okay, so maybe a couple more questions if people have them, and I probably will ask you to go one after the other, and then we'll just collect two questions, and then we'll have people respond. So 2 hands. No? Yes, Doug. Doug, and then another person. Think about asking another question.
I just have a very quick comment. The one thing that Peter didn't mention about the journal Indonesia that's really fascinating and critical for understanding it is that it has never been a peer-reviewed journal.
Well, that's in the 100th issue. There's a series of pieces that people who have been involved in it wrote about its history, including Audrey, including Ben, actually. And what those pieces say is that when Audrey came in, a level of professionalization begins that includes peer review. Now, I'm not sure how rigorous it is or consistent it is, but I also talked to Deborah Hampshire, and according to Deborah, during her tenure, peer review is practiced. Is it double-blind peer review with 2 people every time? No, it's not. And sometimes it's someone sort of vaguely internal. But the big transition is from, it seems like, and maybe other people, maybe Hank, maybe others can shed more light on this, it goes from literally no peer review to, in the late 70s, some kind of crude peer review. Is that fair to say? Yeah, who could be his peer? Yeah, it's peerless review.
Okay, one more question. Bailin. Please. Oh, Sarah.
Actually, this is very short and links in with the previous question. I was associated with a journal, World Politics, which is a pretty good journal, that involved a lot of internal reviewing by one of the things about the journal Indonesia that strikes me as interesting is that, like so many of Ben Anderson's other works, it was disruptive, illogical, different from the way things are normally done. He was, as it was emphasized, in a department of government, not of political science. That is useful. The themes that have come up here, Ireland, being an alien everywhere, and being revolutionary in an Irish sense without, I guess, spending much time in Ireland, never sleeping, just working very, very hard. Translation as leading to conflict and politics, well, but is that a bad thing? That's another theme that has come up. This question that comes out of Thongchai's talk, how to make more transnational citizens, if you will, is really very important. And it strikes me that academe is doing a dismal job of this. There are faddists in practically every disciplinary field of certainly in political science, certainly also in many of the more hermeneutic or humanistic studies. There's too much differentiation now, I think, between humanists and social scientists, as if one used language and the other used only language and the other used only numbers. What can we do actively to change this? We have airplanes now. We could admit more people to places like Cornell and Berkeley, where there are good traditions of revolutionary ideas and thinking out of the box. But also we could use airplanes much more and send young people for extended periods into more than one country, into China and into Indonesia, for example, to encourage the kind of comparison that I was suggesting earlier. It strikes me there are things to do, and we're just not doing them in academia because of bureaucratic inertia.
Okay, thank you. Thongchai, do you want to respond? Because this is about translingual global.
In short, that's why I said earlier that I'm thinking along the same line of the question, but I have no answer. All the thing I can do is just to raise the issue. This is something we should pay attention to. On the other hand, keep in mind that university is built along the line of disciplines since the late 19th century. And to some extent, to a great extent, we are still in that mode.
Well, thank you. So we're out of time. In fact, we are a bit late, running late. So we'll reconvene at 2 p.m. Here. And thank you for coming. And thanks to the panelists.